The Galactic Council had ruled the stars for over 3,000 years. Their great station orbited the center of the galaxy, a massive structure that housed representatives from 847 different species. Each species had earned their place through centuries of careful diplomacy, technological advancement, and most importantly, peaceful behavior. On this particular day, Council Representative Zixthan of the Valerian Empire stood before the assembled delegates. His blue-scaled form towered over the podium as he prepared to announce what he considered routine business. The newest species to be discovered would soon receive the great honor of becoming protected subjects under Council law. The species in question called themselves humans. They lived on a small blue planet they named Earth, located in a quiet arm of the galaxy. The Council's scouts had been watching them for several decades now, and the reports were typical of primitive civilizations. The humans fought wars among themselves, polluted their own planet, and had only recently managed to leave their atmosphere in crude metal ships. Zix then activated the holographic display, showing images of Earth and its inhabitants. The assembled delegates murmured their approval. These humans looked harmless enough with their soft skin and small stature. They appeared to be typical mammals, probably descended from some form of tree-dwelling creature. The Council's greatest strength was its ability to guide younger species toward civilization. They had done this hundreds of times before. Wild species like the humans always needed firm guidance to prevent them from destroying themselves or causing trouble for their neighbors. The formula was simple and had never failed. First, they would declare the species as protected subjects. This gave the Council legal authority over their actions and prevented other galactic powers from interfering. Second, they would install monitoring stations around the species' home system to watch for dangerous activities. Third, they would restrict the species' movement beyond their home system until they proved they could behave properly. Finally, they would collect tribute in the form of cultural artifacts and natural resources. The process usually took 50 to 100 years, depending on how quickly the new species learned to follow Council regulations. Some species adapted faster than others, but all of them eventually came to appreciate the wisdom of Council guidance. After all, who would not want to be part of the greatest civilization the galaxy had ever known? Zixthan cleared his throat and began the formal announcement. The humans had been observed for long enough. Their technology was advancing rapidly, which could become dangerous if left unchecked. Their tendency toward violence was concerning. Most troubling of all, they had started to venture beyond their home planet, which meant they might soon encounter other species. The Council could not allow an unguided species to spread through the galaxy. History was full of examples of what happened when primitive species gained access to advanced technology without proper supervision. Wars, destruction, and chaos always followed. The humans needed to be brought under Council protection before they caused any serious problems. The vote was unanimous, as expected. 847 species agreed that humanity should become protected subjects of the Galactic Council. Zixthan smiled with satisfaction as he recorded the decision in the official records. Another primitive species would soon learn the benefits of civilization. 3 days later, Zixthan's personal ship arrived in Earth's solar system. He had volunteered to deliver the news personally, as he enjoyed meeting new species and explaining their great fortune. The humans had built a space station they called the International Space Station, where representatives from their various nations worked together. It seemed like the perfect place to make first contact. The humans' reaction to his arrival was immediate and intense. Their primitive radio waves filled space with excited chatter. Military forces around the planet went to high alert. News broadcasts interrupted regular programming to announce that aliens had arrived. Zixthan watched with amusement as the humans scrambled to respond to something they had clearly never expected. Eventually, the humans managed to arrange a meeting. Their leaders gathered at a place called the United Nations Building in New York City. Zixthan found it quaint that they still needed a special building for their primitive form of government, but he appreciated their effort to present a unified response. The human leaders looked nervous as Zixthan entered their assembly hall. They were smaller than he had expected, barely reaching his waist even when standing on their raised platform. Their translator devices worked reasonably well, though they sometimes missed the subtle meanings of superior galactic languages. Zixthan began his prepared speech with the traditional greeting used for all new protected species. He explained the great honor that was being bestowed upon humanity. The Galactic Council, in its infinite wisdom, had chosen to take the human species under its protection. From this day forward, humanity would be guided by the most advanced civilization in the galaxy. The benefits were numerous, he explained. Humans would no longer need to worry about making dangerous mistakes with their primitive technology. The Council would monitor their activities and prevent them from accidentally destroying themselves. Their movement beyond Earth would be carefully regulated to ensure they did not cause problems for more advanced species. In return, humans would provide tribute in the form of cultural artifacts and natural resources. Zix then expected the usual response from newly contacted species. Gratitude, awe, and eager acceptance were the normal reactions. Some species even wept with joy at being chosen for such an honor. He waited for the human leaders to express their appreciation for the Council's generous offer. Instead, the humans began to laugh. Not the nervous laughter of beings overwhelmed by good fortune, but genuine amusement. One of their leaders, a woman from a nation called the United States, actually wiped tears from her eyes as she struggled to control her giggles. Another leader, an older man from something called the European Union, stood up and began speaking rapidly in his native language. The translator indicated he was saying something about historical experiences with uninvited protection. The tone suggested he was not pleased with the offer. A representative from a nation called Russia leaned back in his chair and asked a question that Zixthan found completely unexpected. The human wanted to know what would happen if humanity politely declined the Council's generous offer. This had never happened before in the 3,000 years of Council history. Zixthan patiently explained that the offer was not actually optional. The Council had already voted and the decision was final. Humanity was now under Council protection whether they wanted it or not. This was for their own good and the good of the galaxy. Primitive species were not qualified to make such important decisions for themselves. The laughter stopped. The human leaders exchanged glances that Zixthan could not interpret. One of them, a man from China, asked for a brief recess to discuss the situation. Zixthan agreed, confident that once the humans understood their situation, they would accept it gracefully like all the other species before them. When the humans returned, their attitude had changed completely. The American representative stood up and delivered what she called humanity's official response to the Council's declaration. Her words were polite but firm. Humanity appreciated the Council's interest but must respectfully decline their protection. Earth would remain independent and self-governing. Furthermore, she continued, humanity would not accept restrictions on their space travel, would not provide tribute to any galactic authority, and would not submit to monitoring by foreign powers. If the Council wished to establish diplomatic relations with Earth, they were welcome to do so on equal terms. Otherwise, humanity would prefer to be left alone. Zixthan was speechless. In 3,000 years of galactic diplomacy, no species had ever rejected Council protection. The very idea was impossible to understand. How could these primitive creatures think they were qualified to govern themselves? Did they not realize how dangerous the galaxy could be for unprotected species? He tried to explain the situation more clearly. Perhaps the humans had misunderstood due to their primitive translation technology. The Council's decision was not a request or an offer. It was a statement of fact. Humanity was now a protected species whether they liked it or not. Resistance was not only futile but completely illogical. The European representative smiled and said something that made the other humans chuckle again. The translation came through as, "Good luck with that." Zixthan did not understand what luck had to do with legal declarations, but the human's tone suggested some form of challenge. As the meeting ended, Zixthan felt confused and slightly irritated. The humans had not followed the script that every other species had followed for thousands of years. They showed no gratitude for the Council's protection, no fear of galactic dangers, and no respect for superior authority. Instead, they seemed to find the entire situation amusing. As he prepared to leave Earth, Zixthan consoled himself with the knowledge that the humans would learn to appreciate Council guidance once the monitoring stations were installed, and restrictions began to take effect. All primitive species went through a period of 3 weeks after Zixthan's departure from Earth. The first Council monitoring stations began reporting unusual activity. The reports were subtle at first, just small deviations from expected behavior patterns that the automated systems flagged for review. But as the days passed, These deviations became more frequent and more puzzling. The humans were not following any of the predicted patterns from the Council's extensive database of primitive species behavior. According to 3,000 years of experience, newly contacted species typically went through 5 stages: denial, fear, bargaining, depression, and finally acceptance. The humans seemed to have skipped straight to something the database had no category for. Instead of accepting their new status, Earth's governments were doing something unprecedented in galactic history. They were working together. The United Nations, previously a weak organization that mostly passed symbolic resolutions, suddenly became the center of intense diplomatic activity. Nations that had been enemies for centuries were now sharing technology and resources. The first sign of trouble came when human spacecraft began appearing near the monitoring stations. These were not the crude metal ships the Council had observed before. Somehow, in just 3 weeks, human technology had improved dramatically. Their new ships moved faster, maneuvered better, and carried equipment that the monitoring stations could not identify. The human ships did not attack the monitoring stations. Instead, they did something far more disturbing. They started talking to them. Human voices began broadcasting on emergency frequencies, asking the stations if they needed help with anything. The humans offered to share coffee, directions, and something called pizza delivery. When the station operators tried to ignore these communications, the humans became more creative. They began broadcasting what they called music at frequencies that caused hallucinations in Zephyrian operators. They sent mathematical proofs that made crystalline computers overheat. They transmitted jokes that the automated translation systems could not process without crashing. Meanwhile, on planets throughout Council space, humans began appearing as tourists. They claimed to be independent travelers exploring the galaxy. When asked how they had obtained the necessary permits for galactic travel, they produced documents that were technically valid, but had been issued by Earth's newly formed Department of Galactic Affairs. These human tourists were unlike any beings the Council worlds had ever encountered. They ignored most cultural protocols, asked inappropriate questions, and seemed genuinely confused by concepts like proper respect for authority. They tipped service workers in strange Earth currencies, took pictures of everything, and complained loudly when restaurants did not serve something called hamburgers. On the trading world of Nexus Prime, a group of humans set up what they called a gift shop. They sold items that were supposedly traditional Earth artifacts, but turned out to be elaborate practical jokes. Crystalline beings who purchased human mood rings found their entire bodies changing color at embarrassing moments. Zephyrians who bought human novelty items discovered that their purchases made loud noises at random intervals. The humans claimed these effects were completely accidental. They expressed great concern and offered full refunds, along with replacement items that usually caused different but equally inconvenient problems. When local authorities tried to shut down their operations, the humans produced permits from 17 different government agencies, none of which wanted to take responsibility for revoking them. More troubling was what the humans did with Council technology. Every piece of equipment they encountered was treated as a fascinating puzzle to be solved. Security systems that had protected Council facilities for centuries suddenly began malfunctioning in creative ways. Doors opened at random intervals, elevators played human music, and atmospheric controls began producing oxygen at levels that made most species feel slightly dizzy. When Council technicians investigated these malfunctions, they found no evidence of tampering. The systems had simply been convinced to operate in ways their designers had never intended. Human engineers claimed they were just trying to help improve efficiency and user-friendliness. They offered to fix any problems their improvements had caused, usually by implementing even more creative solutions. The most disturbing development was happening among other protected species. For 3,000 years, these civilizations had accepted Council guidance without question. They followed regulations, paid tribute, and stayed within their assigned territories. Now some of them were beginning to ask uncomfortable questions about why these rules were necessary. The questions started after humans began visiting protected species worlds. The humans expressed amazement at how advanced these civilizations were, and wondered aloud why such capable beings needed protection from anyone. They introduced concepts like individual rights, self-determination, and something called civil disobedience that had no equivalent in any galactic language. On the world of Harmony 4, The melodic collective began holding what they called peaceful protests. These consisted of thousands of beings standing in public squares and singing songs that gradually became louder and more complex until the local administration buildings vibrated at dangerous frequencies. When asked to stop, the protesters claimed they were simply practicing their traditional music, which was technically protected under council cultural preservation laws. The Zephyrians started experiencing what they called spontaneous art installations. Overnight, their crystal cities would be decorated with patterns of bioluminescent algae that formed messages visible from orbit. The messages were always polite requests for minor changes to local regulations, but they could not be removed without damaging the crystal structures they covered. The crystalline hegemony developed a habit of experiencing technical malfunctions that always seemed to happen at the most inconvenient times for council operations. Supply ships would arrive to find loading docks mysteriously offline. Communication relays would develop interference that lasted exactly as long as official council broadcasts. Computer systems would become confused about exchange rates whenever tribute payments were due. When council investigators tried to determine the cause of these problems, they found no evidence of deliberate sabotage. The malfunctions appeared to be random equipment failures. However, the timing was suspiciously convenient, and repair crews reported finding small improvements to the systems that made them more efficient, but somehow more prone to these specific types of failures. Back on Earth, human activity was reaching levels that the monitoring stations could barely track. Massive construction projects had begun in Earth's asteroid belt. New spacecraft were launching daily, each one incorporating technologies that should have taken decades to develop. Human scientists were sharing research data at speeds that made council computers struggle to process the information. Most concerning of all, humans had begun reverse engineering council technology with frightening efficiency. Equipment that had taken council scientists centuries to perfect was being duplicated and improved by humans in a matter of weeks. The improvements were often small but significant, making the technology more reliable, more efficient, or more user-friendly. Human engineers claimed they were simply fixing obvious design flaws that any competent engineer would notice immediately. They offered to share their improvements with the original designers, along with helpful suggestions for further enhancements. These offers were always made with complete sincerity and genuine enthusiasm for collaborative problem-solving. As reports of human activities reached the council chambers, emergency sessions were called to address what officials were beginning to call the human problem. Representatives from hundreds of worlds demanded action to restore order to the galaxy. The council's neat hierarchical system was developing cracks, and those cracks were spreading faster than anyone had anticipated. Zixthan stood before the assembled council once again, but this time his confidence was shaken. The simple task of integrating one primitive species had somehow become a galaxy-wide crisis. The humans had not responded to council authority the way any rational species should. Instead, they had treated the entire situation as some kind of challenge to be overcome through creativity and persistence. Worse yet, their example was spreading. Other protected species were beginning to question rules they had followed for generations. Trade routes were becoming unreliable as technical malfunctions increased. Council authority was being challenged not through violence or rebellion, but through something far more dangerous: independence and creative thinking. The council would have to take stronger action to bring the humans under control. The alternative was unthinkable: the complete collapse of the galactic order that had maintained peace and stability for 3,000 years. Zixthan began preparing recommendations for more aggressive intervention. Surely a show of overwhelming force would convince the humans to accept their proper place in the galaxy. He had no way of knowing that the humans were already 3 steps ahead of him, and that every escalation would only make their situation worse. The humans had spent their entire history dealing with bullies, tyrants, and would-be conquerors. They had developed strategies for handling superior force that the Council had never encountered. The Galactic Council's enforcement fleet was the most powerful military force in known space. 200 ships from 50 different species, representing 3,000 years of accumulated military technology and strategic experience. Never in galactic history had the fleet been deployed against a single planet. The very idea was considered overkill beyond measure. Admiral Vextar, supreme commander of the fleet, reviewed the deployment orders with growing irritation. A single primitive world required the attention of 200 warships. The humans had exactly 4 space stations and maybe 50 spacecraft, none of which posed any serious threat to Council technology. This was like using a plasma cannon to kill an insect. Still, orders were orders. The Council had made its decision after the human problem had spread to dozens of protected species worlds. Reports of creative civil disobedience, technical malfunctions, and completely inappropriate questions about authority had reached crisis levels. The humans needed to be taught a lesson that would remind everyone in the galaxy about the consequences of defying Council authority. The fleet's approach to Earth was designed to be impressive. Ships emerged from hyperspace in perfect formation, their weapons powered but not yet aimed. The display of overwhelming force should convince even the most stubborn humans that resistance was futile. Every species that had seen the enforcement fleet had immediately surrendered without firing a shot. The human response was immediate, but completely unexpected. Instead of the usual terror and desperate surrender attempts, Earth's communication networks lit up with excited chatter. Human news broadcasts interrupted regular programming to announce that the aliens were back and had brought friends. Military forces went to alert status, but their radio traffic suggested anticipation rather than fear. Admiral Vextar opened a communication channel to Earth and began the standard surrender demand. The humans were ordered to immediately cease all unauthorized activities, accept Council protection, and prepare for occupation by peacekeeping forces. Any resistance would be met with overwhelming force. The deadline for compliance was 24 hours. The human response came from the same woman who had spoken at the United Nations months earlier. Her message was broadcast on all frequencies, so that every ship in the fleet could hear it clearly. She thanked the Admiral for his visit and cordially invited him and his crew to enjoy their stay in the Sol system. Earth's tourism board had prepared welcome packages for all visitors. She went on to explain that humanity's official response to the surrender demand was a polite but firm decline. Earth would remain independent, and any attempt to impose foreign authority would be met with appropriate measures. However, she emphasized that humans held no ill will toward the fleet, and hoped that any unpleasantness could be avoided through reasonable discussion. Admiral Vextar was speechless. In 2 centuries of military service, he had never encountered such casual defiance of superior force. The humans were treating the most powerful fleet in galactic history like unwelcome door-to-door salespeople. Their tone suggested they found the entire situation mildly annoying rather than terrifying. The 24-hour deadline passed without any sign of human surrender. Instead, Earth launched dozens of small spacecraft that approached the fleet in seemingly random patterns. The Admiral ordered his ships to maintain defensive positions and await further instructions. The human ships were too small to pose any threat, but their behavior was puzzling. The first indication that something was wrong came when several fleet ships reported strange audio transmissions. The humans were broadcasting what they called music directly into ship hulls using some kind of resonance technology. The music was designed to cause specific psychological effects in different species. Zephyrian crews began experiencing vertigo, while crystalline operators developed an irresistible urge to dance. Other ships found their translation systems overloaded by streams of human cultural references that made no logical sense. Broadcasts about something called ancient memes contained information patterns that caused computer systems to crash while attempting to analyze their meaning. Human entertainment programs featuring singing competitions somehow caused chaos in fleet communication networks. The Admiral ordered his communications officers to block all human transmissions, but the humans had somehow anticipated this strategy. Their broadcasts began arriving through the fleet's own communication relays, having been bounced off asteroids, moons, and space debris in patterns that made them impossible to block without shutting down all ship-to-ship communications. Human ships began performing maneuvers that violated every principle of military tactics. They moved in seemingly random patterns that made no strategic sense, but somehow prevented the fleet from achieving clear targeting solutions. When fleet commanders tried to predict human movements using standard tactical computers, the calculations became so complex that the systems overheated. The humans employed strategies that had no equivalent in any military database. They used humor as a weapon, broadcasting comedy shows that made fleet crews laugh at inappropriate moments. They sent messages expressing genuine concern for the mental health of soldiers far from home, offering counseling services and care packages. They somehow made their opponents feel guilty for threatening them. When Admiral Vextar finally ordered his ships to begin actual combat operations, the humans revealed their most devastating weapon: complete unpredictability. Human tactics made no sense according to any known strategic principles. They treated space combat like some kind of elaborate game, complete with running commentary that was broadcast to both sides. Human ships that should have been destroyed by fleet weapons somehow survived hits that would have vaporized normal spacecraft. Investigation revealed that the humans had reinforced their hulls with materials that should not have been able to withstand military-grade plasma weapons. Somehow they had improved upon Council technology without access to the original design specifications. The turning point came when the humans managed to capture one of the fleet's smaller vessels. The boarding action was unlike anything in military history. Instead of violence, the humans used what they called aggressive friendship. They welcomed the crew aboard their ship, offered them food and entertainment, and began enthusiastically explaining human culture. The captured crew was treated so well that they began to question why they were fighting these strange but friendly beings. The humans returned them to the fleet along with gift bags containing Earth souvenirs and a formal invitation to visit Earth as tourists once the unpleasantness was over. They also included helpful suggestions for improving fleet ship design and crew comfort, but the humans' masterstroke was still to come. They had rigged their captured fleet vessel with what they cheerfully called a glitter bomb. When the ship was returned to the fleet, it exploded in a shower of millions of tiny reflective particles that covered Admiral Vextar's flagship from bow to stern. The glitter was completely harmless, but absolutely impossible to remove. It stuck to every surface, infiltrated every system, and sparkled constantly in the light of nearby stars. The Admiral's proud flagship, terror of 100 worlds, now looked like a children's party decoration. News of the incident spread through fleet communications faster than official orders. The psychological impact was devastating. Fleet crews began suffering from something human psychologists called secondary embarrassment on behalf of their commanding officers. Morale collapsed as soldiers struggled to maintain military discipline while serving aboard ships that sparkled like holiday decorations. Combat efficiency dropped to levels that made continued operations impossible. Admiral Vextar called for reinforcements, but the Council was reluctant to commit more ships to what was becoming a public relations disaster. Reports of the glitter bomb incident had spread throughout Council space, turning the mighty enforcement fleet into a galactic laughingstock. Military recruitment numbers dropped as potential soldiers decided they did not want to risk similar humiliation. Meanwhile, other human ships were spreading throughout the galaxy, carrying news of their successful resistance to Council authority. Everywhere they went, protected species began asking why they needed protection from beings who could be defeated by glitter and inappropriate humor. The carefully maintained image of Council invincibility was crumbling faster than anyone had thought possible. The Admiral found himself in an impossible position. His fleet was militarily superior to anything the humans could field, but the humans were not fighting a military war. They were fighting a war of perception, morale, and public opinion, and in that kind of conflict, their weapons of mass entertainment and strategic silliness were proving devastatingly effective. As the standoff continued, Admiral Vextar began to understand what the humans had done. They had not defeated the fleet through superior firepower or tactical brilliance. They had simply made it impossible for the fleet to win without looking ridiculous. And in a galaxy where reputation was everything, looking ridiculous was worse than being defeated in honest combat. The humans had turned warfare into entertainment, authority into absurdity, and the most powerful military force. The glitter bomb incident became the spark that ignited a galaxy-wide revolution. Within weeks, every protected species in Council space had heard the story of how tiny Earth had humiliated the mighty enforcement fleet. The humans had proven that the Council could be embarrassed, confused, and made to look foolish. More importantly, they had shown that Council authority was not absolute. On worlds that had submitted to Council protection centuries ago, beings began asking questions they had never dared voice before. Why did advanced civilizations need protection from anyone? Why could they not govern themselves? Why did they have to pay tribute to distant authorities who had never asked what they actually wanted or needed? The Zephyrians were the first to openly embrace human-style resistance tactics. Their crystal cities began experiencing what they called artistic emergencies. Overnight, entire districts would be covered in patterns of living light that spelled out requests for local autonomy. The patterns were so beautiful that tourists came from across the galaxy to see them, making removal politically impossible. When council administrators demanded the removal of these unauthorized art installations, Zephyrian officials claimed they were experiencing technical difficulties with their urban planning systems. The patterns appeared to be caused by quantum fluctuations in their crystal matrices that were impossible to control without shutting down entire cities. The Melodic Collective took a different approach. They began holding concerts that technically followed all council regulations about peaceful assembly and cultural expression. However, these concerts featured songs that somehow caused council broadcast equipment to malfunction whenever officials tried to make announcements. The interference was always temporary and completely accidental, of course. Most troubling for the council was what happened with the crystalline hegemony. These beings had always been the most reliable of protected species, managing supply chains and resource distribution throughout council space. Their sudden development of chronic efficiency problems threatened the economic foundation of the galactic government. Crystalline cargo ships began experiencing navigation errors that caused them to arrive at destinations several days late, always with perfectly reasonable explanations about solar wind interference or asteroid field delays. Supply shipments mysteriously developed quality control issues that required extensive reinspection. Computer systems became confused about exchange rates in ways that consistently favored local economies over council tax collection. Meanwhile, human activity throughout the galaxy had reached levels that made council administrators dizzy, just reading the reports. Human ships were everywhere, carrying passengers and cargo between worlds that had never traded directly before. Human engineers were offering technical consulting, services that somehow always resulted in systems becoming more independent and efficient. Human merchants had established trade networks that bypassed council taxation systems entirely. They claimed these were simple barter arrangements between private individuals, which technically did not violate any existing regulations. However, the volume of these private trades was beginning to compete with official council commerce. What made the situation even more frustrating for council officials was that human improvements to existing systems were undeniably beneficial. Planets that adopted human-designed modifications reported higher productivity, better resource efficiency, and improved quality of life for their populations. The improvements were so obvious that refusing them would have been clearly unreasonable. Human technology had evolved at impossible speeds. Spacecraft that had been crude metal shells just months earlier were now outperforming council designs in every meaningful category. Human ships were faster, more maneuverable, more efficient, and somehow more comfortable for their crews. They also cost a fraction of what equivalent council vessels required to build and maintain. The humans freely shared their technological improvements with anyone who asked. They published research data, provided detailed specifications, and offered training programs for anyone interested in learning their methods. This open approach to knowledge sharing was completely alien to council traditions but proved devastatingly effective at spreading human influence. Council scientists found themselves in the humiliating position of studying human designs to understand how beings with supposedly primitive technology had managed to surpass millennia of galactic engineering progress. The worst part was that human innovations were usually embarrassingly obvious once explained, making council experts wonder why they had never thought of such simple solutions. The economic impact of human activity was becoming impossible to ignore. Worlds that had traded exclusively through council-controlled channels were now participating in direct exchanges that provided better prices and more variety than official markets. Local businesses were thriving as human logistics networks connected previously isolated communities. Human banking systems offered services that council financial institutions had never considered necessary. Concepts like small business loans, investment cooperatives, and profit-sharing arrangements gave local populations access to economic opportunities that had been reserved for major council-approved corporations. The result was an explosion of innovation and entrepreneurship. More troubling for Council leadership was the spread of human political concepts. Protected species populations were beginning to discuss ideas like representative government, individual rights, and democratic decision-making. These concepts had no equivalent in Council political theory, which was based on the assumption that advanced beings should make decisions for less advanced ones. Human diplomats were establishing formal relationships with protected species governments, treating them as equal partners rather than subordinate territories. These diplomatic missions operated with full transparency, publishing their activities and objectives in ways that made Council secret. Negotiations look suspicious by comparison. The Council found itself losing control of the narrative that had justified their authority for 3,000 years. Humans openly questioned the premise that any species needed protection from galactic dangers. They pointed out that most protected species were already advanced enough to handle their own affairs, and that Council protection seemed to consist mainly of taxation and movement restrictions. Human philosophers and political theorists began publishing works that examined the ethical foundations of Council authority. Their arguments were logical, well-researched, and utterly devastating to traditional justifications for galactic government. These publications spread rapidly through human communication networks and were translated into hundreds of local languages. Perhaps most damaging was the human practice of asking simple questions that exposed uncomfortable truths. Why did Council representatives live in luxury, while protected species populations struggled with resource shortages? Why were technological improvements shared only with Council members while everyone else was denied access? Why were local cultures discouraged in favor of standardized Council norms? Emergency sessions of the Council became daily occurrences as representatives struggled to address the growing crisis. Traditional methods of maintaining order were failing catastrophically. Military intervention had backfired spectacularly. Economic pressure was ineffective when humans offered better alternatives. Even propaganda campaigns were undermined by human transparency and fact-checking. The Council's greatest fear was becoming reality: the complete breakdown of galactic order. Protected species were openly defying Council authority. Trade networks were reorganizing around human innovations, and the carefully maintained hierarchy that had preserved peace for millennia was crumbling under the weight of creative rebellion. Representative Zixthan stood before the Council once again, but this time he was not delivering good news about successful integration. Instead, he was forced to recommend the most drastic action in Council history: declaring humanity a hostile species and authorizing total war. It was the only option left for preserving Council authority. The vote was not unanimous this time. Several representatives questioned whether escalation was wise, given humanity's talent for turning any situation to their advantage. But the majority agreed that the alternative was the end of civilization as they knew it. If the humans could not be controlled, they would have to be eliminated. As the Council prepared for total war against humanity, none of them realized that they were about to make their final and greatest mistake. The humans had been preparing for this moment since the day Zixthan first arrived on Earth, and what they had planned would change the galaxy forever. The Council's declaration of total war against humanity was broadcast throughout the galaxy with great ceremony. For the first time in 3,000 years, the full military might of 847 species would be brought to bear against a single world. The humans had gone too far, and now they would face the consequences of defying galactic order. The human response to this declaration was swift and completely unexpected. Instead of preparing for a desperate last stand, Earth launched what they called the galaxy's greatest party. Invitations were sent to every species in Council space, including Council members themselves. The humans announced that if the galaxy was going to end, they might as well have fun doing it. The party was not just on Earth. Human ships spread throughout the galaxy, turning the impending war into a galaxy-wide celebration of chaos and creativity. They set up concert stages on asteroids, hosted comedy shows on space stations, and organized dance competitions on worlds that had never seen public entertainment before. Council military leaders found themselves trying to coordinate a war against an enemy that insisted on treating the conflict as the universe's most elaborate practical joke. Human tactics had evolved beyond mere unpredictability into something approaching performance art. Every battle became a show, complete with running commentary and audience participation. The humans had weaponized joy itself. Their ships broadcast music that made enemy crews stop fighting to dance. They transmitted comedy programs that caused uncontrollable laughter at critical moments. They shared food recipes that were so delicious that enemy soldiers began defecting just to get better meals. The turning point came during the Battle of Nexus Prime, the galaxy's most important trading hub. Council forces had surrounded the planet, preparing for a siege that would demonstrate their overwhelming power. The humans arrived with what appeared to be a small fleet, but turned out to be something far more dangerous: a mobile entertainment complex. Instead of engaging the Council fleet in traditional combat, the humans began broadcasting what they called the greatest concert in galactic history. The performance was visible from orbit and could be heard throughout the star system. It featured musicians from dozens of species, including several Council worlds that had secretly sent their artists to participate. The concert's climax came when humans somehow managed to replace the Council's sacred ceremonial music with what they called death metal. During the most important religious ceremony in Council history, the effect was immediate and devastating. Council representatives could not maintain dignity, while their holiest rituals were accompanied by screaming guitars and thunderous drums. The ceremony descended into chaos as different species reacted in different ways to the unexpected musical accompaniment. Some began dancing involuntarily, others became confused and disoriented, and a few actually discovered they enjoyed the new musical style better than traditional Council compositions. The incident was broadcast live throughout the galaxy, watched by billions of beings who saw their supposedly dignified leaders reduced to helpless confusion by human audio manipulation. The Council's carefully maintained image of invincible authority collapsed in a matter of hours. They became the laughingstock of their own empire. Protected species populations erupted in celebration. If the mighty Council could be humiliated by music, then perhaps they were not as powerful as they claimed. Rebellions that had been simmering for generations suddenly burst into open revolt, but these were unlike any rebellions in galactic history. They were joyful, creative, and completely nonviolent. The humans had taught the galaxy how to rebel through celebration rather than violence. Instead of destroying Council facilities, rebels threw parties in them. Instead of attacking Council personnel, they invited them to join dance competitions. Instead of making demands through force, they made requests through song. Council military doctrine had no provisions for dealing with enemies who insisted on being friendly while destroying your authority. Traditional tactics failed when opponents responded to attack orders with party invitations. How could you fight beings who genuinely wanted you to have a good time while they dismantled your government? The final blow came when humans began broadcasting detailed analyses of Council economics, showing exactly how much money was being spent on maintaining authority compared to how much was actually used to help protected species. The numbers were devastating, revealing a system that existed primarily to benefit those in charge rather than those it claimed to protect. Faced with complete humiliation and the collapse of their empire, the Council leadership finally did something they had never done in 3,000 years of galactic rule. They asked for help. Specifically, they asked the humans what they wanted and whether there was any way to resolve the crisis peacefully. The human response surprised everyone, including many humans themselves. They did not want to rule the galaxy or destroy the Council. They did not seek revenge for the attempted conquest or demand massive concessions. They simply wanted to be left alone to explore, trade, and cause harmless mayhem throughout the galaxy. The peace negotiations were unlike any diplomatic process in galactic history. Humans insisted on complete transparency, with all discussions broadcast live to anyone who wanted to watch. They brought professional mediators, fact-checkers, and comedians to keep the proceedings both honest and entertaining. The final treaty was a masterpiece of creative compromise. Humanity was granted independent chaos agent status, a completely new category in galactic law. They would have full rights to travel, trade, and interact with any species that wanted their company, but no obligations to follow Council regulations that they found unreasonable. In exchange, humans agreed to limit their reality-bending shenanigans to non-essential Council operations. They would not interfere with truly important Council functions like maintaining interstellar law and preventing actual conflicts. However, they reserved the right to point out when Council policies were obviously stupid and suggest better alternatives. other protected species, were given the option to renegotiate their own relationships with the Council. Many chose to remain under Council protection, but with significantly more autonomy and better terms. Others opted for complete independence, often with human support for their transition to self-governance. The galaxy that emerged from the human crisis was very different from the one that had existed before. Trade flourished as human innovations improved transportation and communication. Scientific research accelerated as humans shared their rapid development techniques. Cultural exchange exploded as humans introduced concepts like tourism and entertainment to species that had forgotten how to have fun. The Council found that governing a galaxy of happy, prosperous, and slightly chaotic worlds was actually more enjoyable than maintaining order through fear and authority. Council representatives began to appreciate human suggestions for improving government efficiency, even when those suggestions came with jokes about bureaucratic incompetence. Human diplomatic missions established permanent offices throughout Council space, but these operated more like community centers than government buildings. They offered services like conflict mediation, technical consultation, and party planning to anyone who needed help solving problems or just wanted to have a good time. Perhaps most importantly, humans had taught the galaxy that authority without consent was ultimately fragile. No matter how powerful a government appeared, it could not survive if its people decided to simply stop taking it seriously. The threat of human-style creative rebellion became a powerful check on authoritarian tendencies throughout the galaxy. Years later, Representative Zixthan would often reflect on the day he first arrived on Earth to deliver what he thought was routine good news to a primitive species. He had expected gratitude, submission, and the continuation of galactic order as it had existed for 3,000 years. Instead, he had unleashed the most creative force the galaxy had ever seen. The humans had not conquered the galaxy through superior technology or military might. They had won through something far more powerful: the ability to make everyone around them happier, more creative, and more free. It was, Zixthan grudgingly admitted, probably the best possible outcome for everyone involved. The galaxy had learned an important lesson about humanity. They were not dangerous because they were aggressive or warlike, but because they were adaptable, creative, and absolutely refused to accept that problems could not be solved through friendship, ingenuity, and strategic application of glitter bombs, and the galaxy was a much more interesting place because of it.